Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming today. I am Caralene Robinson, and I'm the Chief Growth Officer of Global Citizen. I am also a marketer and content creator who has been committed to diverse stories my entire life, and I'm so happy to be with this group today. I am joined by Prisca, who is the VP and Head of Partnerships at the Asian American Foundation, Ndopu, the UN Secretary General, SDG advocate, Marc Pritchard, the Chief Brand Officer of PNG, and Yemi Adamolekun, active citizen and connector Enough is Enough, and also a 2021 GC Prize honoree. Thank you for being here. As you just heard from Prime Minister Motley and Prime Minister Trudeau, there is much to be done to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is especially true when it comes to equity and inclusion. I want to first share with you some statistics that will put this in perspective. Women account for just 4.6% of the CEOs currently running a global 500 business. 90% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school. Out of 141 countries, 57% experience increases in acceptance for LGBTIQ+ people, but 33% experienced a decline. So when we talked about doing this panel, we wanted to skip past two things. One is that equity inclusion is important, we got that. And second, that there's much to be done. Our panel today features 4 transformative leaders who've been unapologetic about advancing equity within their spaces of ownership. And I wanted them to talk to you today and give you tools. Their work has proven that not only can this work be in the spirit of good, but it can also be done in the spirit of growth. So let's get started. Prisca. The Asian American Foundation's 2022 Status Index report says that Asian Americans are the least likely to feel that they belong and are accepted in the US. The report also states that there is broad agreement that people of color are much more discriminated against and much less advantaged compared to white Americans. How are you in the foundation working to change this narrative?
Thank you. I think everyone in this room is in agreement that there's discrimination in the US and the people of color are absolutely at a disadvantage, so I just want to set that table. The Asian American Foundation is a new organization we launched 1 year ago and the rise of hate against Asian Americans. And if you live in New York City, you know what I'm talking about. And if you're Asian American and I see you in the room, you feel this very personally. In the last few years in New York City, I've never felt more unsafe. And I think that, all across the country, we're feeling this. So my board at the Asian American Foundation came together, board members like the co-founder of Yahoo, Jerry Yang, the co-founder of Alibaba, and the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, Joe Tsai. I say their names because these very powerful, successful men came together to found an organization for the Asian American community. They funded it at $125 million over 5 years because our community needed an organization to stand up for us. And so when I came to help launch the organization, my background is in corporate diversity. I see many friends in the room. I focus mostly on women's issues. And I told them that even though I was in some of the most inclusive rooms on the most inclusive teams, Asian American issues just weren't on the agenda. We're not in budgets, we're not in the conversation. And I'm looking around to see how many Asian Americans are in the room today. And I'm hoping that'll change, and I know that this is changing right now. And so with the Asian American Foundation, what we're trying to do is talk to corporations about Asian Americans and diversity, but not because we want to take from other budgets. When we have these conversations with our partners, and we brought in over 60 partners at our launch, we are very mindful to say that we are not taking from anyone's budget. We want you to grow your budgets. We're working in solidarity with other communities of color, with all the feminists. So that is sort of the role that we're trying to play. We're trying to be another external stakeholder, just like Global Citizen, to say to corporations, we need to do more. And so we're really proud to be in this space.
And it's a very important role indeed. Eddie, as an SDG advocate, what do you think needs to be done to get us back on track? And how can the UN and leaders worldwide help close the inclusion gap?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the SDGs are not this abstract public policy enterprise. It is a question of life and death for so many of us. It's existential. And what I will say is that I think that the concept of leadership is far too important to be left up to leaders. And what I mean by that is that we can't conflate bureaucratic processes with the very real urgent need for equity, right? And so what that means is that we need to be amplifying voices of people who are furthest behind the line of opportunity. The truth of the matter is that we're catching fire. If you're Black, if you're Indigenous, if you're a person of color, if you are disabled, if you are a woman, if you are from persecuted minority groups, the world right now feels incredibly bleak, right? And so I'm concerned not only about the abandonment of the SDGs because of the various geopolitical issues that are confronting the world, but I'm particularly concerned with the retreat on the leaving nobody behind aspect of the SDGs. I think we need to return to this idea of leaving nobody behind beyond a rhetoric. It's got to be practiced. And what I would say is that I think folks need to step aside and actually allow those of us who are furthest behind to really lead and shape the discourse.
I agree. Yemi, and once again, congratulations on your GC Prize honor. Tell us about the mission of Enough is Enough and the work you're doing to drive inclusion in Nigeria.
Thank you. Enough is Enough started from a protest. So 2010, we organized a protest. And then we realized we couldn't really protest every time we were angry because the sheer energy to get numbers on the streets was just not sustainable. And 2011 was an election year in Nigeria. And we decided to channel that energy into elections, getting young people to participate in the process and choose leaders that reflected what they wanted. Now, over the last 12 years, in addition to doing election-related work, next year is another election year in Nigeria, we've also realized that for a country that has a history of military rule, culture, and religion shaping how people engage power, citizens just didn't understand what a democracy meant. Democracy is not elections, but that was our barometer. And so Nigeria is called a democracy, but it's actually quite repressive in a lot of ways. So the idea was to get citizens to understand that they had power. And that was framed in our concept of the office of the citizen, and saying that it's the highest office in the land, not the office of the president. And so getting citizens to understand their rights and responsibilities in that context, to be able to hold elected officials accountable and demand better governance. So in addition to elections, in addition to protests, which we still organize, we also spend a lot of time educating citizens, leveraging social media and radio.
Congrats. Yes. Marc, PNG is an exception to the norm in the private sector. You say that citizenship must be a force for good and a force for growth. Tell us about your work at PNG.
Sure. What that concept is, I was once told 25 years ago, business could be the greatest force for good in the future. Now, what we realize is that it has to go hand in hand with being a force for growth. In fact, we've flipped it to say we need to be a force for growth in order to be a more powerful force for good. Because the private sector is in business. We drive growth. Growth in and of itself is good, economic good. Economic good, if you grow markets, can make markets bigger, all boats can rise. Economic inclusion can occur when growth is done. And then businesses, if they focus on things that make sense for their business, can do even more good for society, for the planet. And so what we have been thinking is that with this force for growth, force for good, what can we make a difference on? A couple of examples. We are the world's largest advertiser. We hit 5 billion people on the planet every day. The images in our advertising matter. We strive for the accurate portrayal of every individual, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, religion, body type, age. Because when you have an accurate portrayal, then people start seeing what reality is versus the tropes and the stereotypes that lead to bias. We also take a step further. and we periodically shine the light on bias or shine a light on issues. So for example, you mentioned about menstrual health. We did end period poverty on Always and Whisper. Always and Whisper is a period product. So what we did is we made available, whenever you buy a product, we will donate a pad. And we've donated 160 million pads in 25 million markets around the world in addition. So that's an example of doing that. And then what we've also done is we've done things like the talk. The talk was focused on shining the light on the talk that black parents still have with their children because they're going to face bias and prejudice. We did the look to shine the light on the everyday aggression that black men face. We did the choice when George Floyd was killed to really try to encourage the white community to step up and use their power for good. And then we just released the name, which is focused on the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to be able to create belonging. Those are the kinds of things that create conversations, and they spark belonging, inclusiveness, and start to move toward a more equitable approach. Final thing, we put our money to create equality in our entire supply chain, including our creative and media supply chain. When you have equality, for example, behind the camera, what that does is allows you to make sure you have images that are accurate. It also raises economic inclusion. When economic inclusion, then we donate a lot of the stuff that we produce to black-owned media companies, because what that does is give them the opportunity to be able to get their businesses going, and that ultimately will drive growth, which will lead to more good.
It's amazing work. Yemi, this next question is for you. According to the World Bank's State of Economic Inclusion report last year, economic inclusion programs are on the rise in 75 countries, benefiting nearly 92 million people. What do you think this aid needs to look like, and what can world leaders do to create lasting change towards extreme poverty?
Well, 92 million people helped, but if I'm not mistaken, there are almost 700 million people living in extreme poverty. So there's still a huge gap. And in shaping that, the data also showed that, I believe, economic empowerment programs for women were the most successful. So we say, the American note says, "In God we trust," and then the corollary to that is, every other person bring data. Now, if data shows you that women's empowerment yields greater results, then let's put more money in there. So one is investing more in women-focused programs so you can get the outcomes that we need. Two, world leaders, I think there's a need for a lot more courage and compassion in putting actual plans to commitments that goes beyond paper. And also in terms of debt reduction, the way that aid is structured, you can't, and I think Prime Minister Motley was speaking to this about the ability to access funding and access borrowing, that if we're lending money to countries or reducing their debt in whatever format, ensuring that those reductions go towards poverty reduction programs. So it's not just commitments, but actual plans that then follow to get the results that we're looking for. But again, can't emphasize that enough. If data shows that supporting more women gives you better results, then follow the data and let's do more of that.
Prisca, in your organization, what kind of dialogue are you having with companies, and how can companies engage with you?
So our corporate engagement strategy is something called the AAPI Giving Challenge. When we were launching the organization, we saw a research report that said 0.2% of philanthropy went to Asian American organizations. 0.2% in recent years. I mean, that's teeny, right? And I think we all know, if anyone is in charge of a corporate foundation, think about your budget and think about how much is actually going to an Asian American organization. Think about how much is actually going to organizations led by people of color. Probably not enough. And so the Giving Challenge is a strategy to just bring companies in. What we did was ask companies, what are you doing for Asian American communities? Can you tell us what that is over 5 years? Because we knew that if we asked for 5 years, then it would likely stay in the budget. So added together, 16 companies in 6 weeks gave us over $1 billion. In commitments to the Asian American community. It's a big number, but it's not big enough. So our goal is just to meet companies where they are. You know, we were not going to shame anyone for not doing enough. So that's why we were able to bring in so many companies. And the good news is these companies are super engaged. So whatever they told us, you know, on day one, a year later, they're increasing, they're doing more. And my favorite company, and I'm not just saying this because Marc is on stage, but PNG, what I love about what PNG is doing is it's not just corporate foundation giving, right? It's not just charitable giving. They're actually using their marketing dollars to make change for the Asian American community. This film called The Name, I don't know how many people in the room saw it. Can you raise your hands if you did? I mean, it's beautiful. Please look it up. It's all about how, you know, some of us in the room who grew up with names that weren't John or Frank or Jenny, you know, people mispronounce it, and how it's okay to ask, how do you pronounce your name? And for me, I'm Korean American. My first name is a Korean name. It's Chang-suk. I've literally never said that out loud in a crowd, so I'm debuting her. But I stopped. No, but I stopped using that name when I was a kid because some teacher butchered it. And I hated it. I hated how it sounded. And so for me to see this film, and it's a film by PNG, right? And you're thinking like, oh, is this going to be cheesy? But it is so beautiful. And it really, ever since I saw it last week, I've been thinking about my Korean identity in a way that I've never been doing before. And I do think that for belonging, for all of us, regardless of what race you are, it's about feeling like you can be yourself at work. And if you can't even use your name, then what is that? And I think the other thing that's cool about this is that it allows people to ask, how do I pronounce your name? We're so scared that we're gonna say the wrong thing, right? And so we don't. And so then that, you know, what does that do? It does nothing. And so thank you for this ad. Thank you for all that you're doing for the Asian American community. And I just ask that you continue to do it.
We will.
Thank you.
We are.
We are glad you're here, Chung-Soo. We're glad you're here.
Oh my God, that's crazy. My parents would be thrilled.
Eddie, I want to pivot to something that is very dear to both of us, intersectionality. And none of us are any one thing. You are Black, queer, and disabled. I have heard you say that disabled Black life is often accommodated, even tolerated, but never really celebrated. What do you mean by that, and how can it change?
Great question. Well, what I'll say is that people often think that intersectionality is about gluing together different identities. So we'll take a bit of sexuality, we'll take a bit of disability, a bit of gender there, we'll piece it together, and voila, you've got intersectionality. I think that's a misreading of intersectionality, which is actually a form of analysis that was gifted to us by Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality is a way of understanding how compounded forms of social exclusion produce certain social outcomes for people who are at the crossroads of different forms of identities, right? So it really is a methodology. It's actually a tool. It's not a synonym for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the input, not the output, right? And I think that's really, really, really important that we actually really ground ourselves in an analysis of intersectionality. In terms of celebrating fabulous, disabled, queer Black life, you know, I often say that what makes a space accessible isn't a ramp, right? There's a ramp behind you, which I love, thank you for the ramp. But a ramp doesn't make a space accessible. It provides entry into a building. What makes a space accessible is how all of us, regardless of ability, regardless of identity, are able to come together and feel validated and have access to agency, self-actualization, and really feel dignified, right? So we're not gonna get to intersectionality through compliance or through ticking a box, but it is going to be about celebrating the magic and the beauty of all of the multiplicity of identities that we embody at the same time. I feel so incredibly honored to be all of those identities. I wouldn't want to be anything else. And I think it really is about validating and celebrating our humanity.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Very quickly, last question. This is Global Citizen Now, and this is about taking action. I'd like each of you to tell the audience an action that leaders can take in the fight for equity, what is one thing they can do now? Prisca.
The next time you're in a meeting, look around to see who's not in the room and make sure in the next meeting that they are there.
Thank you. Eddie.
I think I'll piggyback off of that and say that I think, look, we need leadership to change. The face of leadership needs to look different. So I think, let's have more intersectional leaders at the table. Yeah.
Marc.
If you're in the private sector, identify what your business is about and find something that you can be both a force for growth and a force for good. Recognize that things like what we do on the talk, the look, the choice, the name, are ramps into those communities. And those communities you then discover all sorts of incredible opportunities. And that opens the door for a lot more good, and that leads to a lot more growth, and that will sustain it. So find it.
Yemi?
We're deliberate and intentional about different things in our lives, but I would like to encourage every leader to be deliberate about their citizenship. Who am I? Who am I in this space? What does that mean? And what am I going to do with the power that I have? Deliberately waking up every day recognizing that you are a global citizen and you have incredible power.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone.